Thank you, Sandy. And nice to meet everyone. I see 66 plus 66. So it's a nice crowd, but it may be an unusual crowd for me because typically I, of course, give talks to people in economics or in social science more generally. But it's a little bit Sandy's fault that I got to be engaged more with, I guess, where for my family wise, I come from. So my father's an engineer, my brother's an engineer, and I became the social scientist. Um, and then suddenly got in touch because I was awarded a VD project on electrification and its role for development. When I think about development, it is about how to think about changes in why people are poor. What are the causes and how can it be changed? So it's very much related to the way we think the world works, but also what policies ought to be implemented through development funding, business investments that may actually make a change in the end for people, for example, living in Africa. So I gave the talk the title. There's these memes of Africa every 60 seconds, something, but it's definitely true that somebody curses a battery for not working. So what I wanted to do is just to give you an insight into my world as an economist, thinking about this problem. I know very little about technology, so that's your role, but maybe I can inspire some of you and invite some of you to help me think about these problems and where maybe technical fixes can help some of our most pressing development problems. So I'll take you through a little tour, but feel free to ask me any questions now or after or follow up later. As a motivating slide, this won't surprise anybody who's looked at nightlights before, but you can see a strong correlation between where there's electricity and where development is taking place. We see our focus of today will be Africa, where we see lots of little lights, but it's all concentrated in few countries on the coast. And most of the population in rural areas has no access or very little access. And this has implications for their ability to generate incomes. And most are stuck in low productivity agriculture. So this has been sort of the motivating part on thinking about why and how could the role of electricity change outcomes for many in the world. Now, it is not like things aren't changing. If we compare top to bottom here, it is electrification rates in the world in 1980s to 90s and the 2000s, and we already see a clear shift in darker here means a larger percentage of the population has access to electricity. So things are changing, but behind the national statistic hides the fact that it's highly unequal within countries. So particularly electrification is happening in urban areas, but not so much in poor areas, and poverty is concentrated in rural areas, right? So it's also true that poverty is reducing, at least in relative terms. So if we look at the share of the poor of total population, we see that in percentage terms, their fraction is dropping, even though the absolute number of people living on below the poverty line, so less than $1.9 a day, is relatively stable, right? So it isn't like things aren't improving, but we shouldn't be over optimistic either. Things won't happen by itself. Now, things in terms of electrification, there's more lights. Thank God for changes in technology. There are now lots of solar lights available, so people can meet at night, feel safer at night, study at night. But one of the arguments will be is that, of course, that is not enough to reduce poverty by itself, even though it may be a strong sort of push in that direction. Because one of the biggest constraints that people still face, if we list it here, I'm going to focus more on Sierra Leone in a large part of this talk in West Africa, but low access and low reliability are a huge constraint for developments. And if you look at businesses, so this is a World Bank business survey ranking their main problems, then finance is, of course, one. The second is electricity. So fixing that may actually help overcome a huge number of problems for developing businesses and getting one of the engines of growth going, which is business development. Now, if you just flip that and look more at the intensity of the problem, then up to 78%, so close to 80% of firms experience electrical outages, sometimes as frequent as every day of the month. In most cases, it's up to half to 2/3 of the month people have outages, which means that if you run a small business, you can't always run the machinery that you need to operate. It changes your calculation in terms of whether to invest in new machinery, because it isn't just that it isn't working all the time. It also means that if it isn't reliable, and if it shuts off often, the machines are more likely to break. And it's shutting off is a problem, but the surge is as well a problem. So reliable electricity, in addition to access, is still a pervasive issue, even if you fix the problem of getting people hooked up to an energy network. So, okay, so the question has become, can we invest in electrification and thus stimulate growth? And this is, comes from an obvious fact if we looked at the first map, but if we just look around ourselves, it's hard to imagine that development would take place without energy access, right? We all are so extremely dependent on electricity, and it's only gotten worse in at least my year and a half of COVID, because this has been, I'm at the office since now for 2 weeks, but it's been at home and it's been electrified to get access to my students and my colleagues and do my work. But the same sort of motivation has prompted big investment by donors. So the large development donors, think here about the World Bank or the USAID that's the American Development Aid Organization, have launched large programs to try to increase access at least, right? So programs like Lighting Africa, or Powering Africa, always with large scale ambitions. So a lot of funding has flowed into countries to try to beef up the capacity. And one insight that from having studied development economics for the last 20 years is many of the programs start with too little evidence, too little clear ideas on the solutions, but they do start anyways. So the role of my project has been to try to bring some sense, or the coming project, to try to bring some sense to whether these investments make sense and how maybe they ought to be improved. And it isn't just donors, but developing country governments are naturally responding to an increase in funding, right? Creating new development plans, highlighting the need for, electricity or access to energy as a huge growth multiplier. So that sets the agenda for large streams of funding, but also it is the core question for someone like me in development economics who tries to understand what is that process of change that brings more income to someone tomorrow than they have today, a process we call economic growth, and how can we ignite that part? And of course, you can recognize the play on words here, because this is the new sort of lever that donors and governments are using. And the core question then, to me, comes back to the fundamentals of the process of economic growth. For a long time, if you take a historical perspective, for a long time, maybe the last 20 years, people have focused a lot on the role of institutions, saying that development isn't happening because countries are corrupt, or because they aren't democratic enough, or because there isn't protection of property rights, or the business environment isn't protected enough, and hence development is not taking place. I think we see a shift now, a little bit away from just institutions, maybe back to what are fundamental prerequisites for growth, which are large-scale infrastructural projects, which are fundamentals like access to electrification. Of course, that then sparked my interest, because if we see a huge increase in funding, which means we're going to see change, which means I have something I can study. Something is happening in countries where people are starting to build, mini grids or expand the national grid, which allows me to look at change while it's happening. So it's suddenly introduced. A lot of my work is empirical, which means that I go to places where change is happening and try to make sense of what's going on. So my core question is, can these investments bring about development and structural change? What I mean with structural change is, can it fundamentally change the structure of a local economy? Now, I won't have all the answers for you today, but I'm hoping we'll meet again in a few years. But I'll sketch some of the early insights in this. Okay, so what do we know, right, about the role of electricity in growth? Well, there's a positive correlation, as I showed you before. So here we just plotted the electricity consumption on the x-axis and GDP per capita, which is the income per person, on the y-axis, and you can draw a wonderful regression line through all those dots. Every dot is a country, right? So that should motivate you. Of course, the question is, let me go back. What is X here and what is Y? What I have on the next slide is, does it then mean that if we follow the investors around investments in electricity, does growth then take place? Or actually, is it so that countries should become richer so they have the means to invest in something like the electricity network? So when we are presented with a graph or correlation like this, the chicken and egg story on where to start should automatically, right, trigger questions on, like, is it okay that we start here on the x-axis, imagining growth will happen, or whatever we do in terms of investment, if the economy isn't changing, then nothing will change, right? So lots of other factors here that produce these correlations. There's a different business environment in the United States than somewhere else. There's a different structure of the economy. So the core question really is, when we've invested in electricity, will growth automatically happen, or should other things happen at the same time? So should there be complementarities? So let's look at some of the micro evidence here. Well, there's some positive news. So it's a bit of a not so beautiful map, but this is supposed to be Brazil. The blue dots are hydro plants, and there's been a huge expansion in hydro energy in Brazil. That's what the left and the right map should show you. And both access, creation, as well as transmission distribution has increased. And this has meant lots of human development. So people have higher incomes, people have higher education now because of this, which is in all, created economic activity. So this just puts one dot on the map saying, well, when it expands and it's large, economic growth will happen if you looked at individual households, right? That's what we know from a study here. But if you took that study and put it next to the other studies, then the picture is a little bit less optimistic. So the study you saw here is right here in the middle. It's a study that came out around Brazil. If I place it on the map with other studies, South Africa, Nicaragua, we still find positive effects. However, when we looked at other examples from India and Kenya, the effects are actually close to zero or are very small. Right? So if we took the Brazil study to mean, yes, electrification creates economic change, then maybe we should actually look at what most studies say, and then the average here is a small bump and not a huge bump. So that's one takeaway, maybe, to say that if we looked at differences in labor supply, but I'll show you for economic and income changes as well, we should not be as optimistic that it will miraculously happen, right? So here are impacts on education. Some are positive. Again, there's a huge outlier here in Brazil, but it's more an outlier that we looked at before than an average. So the last two studies here, and including one on Kenya, which is, I think, the most careful of all of these, finds very, very little in terms of increases in educational outcomes. So maybe electrification alone is not happening. Well, if we looked at a second strand, which is, it isn't just that electrification may have economic benefits, but there are also environmental benefits. So one of these studies on South Africa shows us very clearly that when people get access to electricity, they start their home production, right? They start changing the way that they cook. So there's a clear shift between the dark bar, which is 1996, and then the lighter gray bar, which is 2001, in whether people are cooking on wood, that is dropping in electrified areas on the left, and whether they're cooking on, with electricity, is going up, right? So if we compare the changes between A and B over time, then electrification allows for an environmental shift, even if it isn't maybe translating into big economic gains. Maybe it is changing what people are doing, in terms of their home production. So maybe that is an environmental benefit that we shouldn't ignore. Similarly, here, a large study in India, this is from a Science Advances paper, randomized whether people got access to off-grid solar things. And I'll motivate this more when we talk about Sierra Leone. And here we see a huge decrease in people's consumption of kerosene, right? So there's a second sort of non-economic benefit of electrification. It changes people's reliance on fossil fuels and on wood. Interesting of this study, it was carefully done. So what I mean there is it worked with the government to actually randomize increased access for households, which means that all other factors are kept constant. And when we are comparing differences between households, we're actually looking at just the effect of getting connected. And that is then sort of a very closely observed difference in terms of everyone or those who actually adopted. There's a huge drop in kerosene use. However, all of these differences coming out of the regressions of whether access is changing savings, investments, business profits, your work time, study, etc., are all not changing. So this is maybe one of the most careful studies, except it says something is shifting, but it isn't enough to create this shift in economic activities of households. Okay, so clear message that comes out of what we know so far: electrification alone is probably not enough. It may also depend on the type of system. So national grid expansion is not feasible everywhere. And we're going to look at an example in the remainder of what we call mini grids. So these are decentralized small grids of solar panels and a battery house. Okay, so let's delve into this and delve into, let me take you to a project in Sierra Leone. So here's an example of a mini grid, which is what I think a promising investment, and we will follow this in the next few years. However, the catch is going to be very ready for you and very much applying to the types of expertise that you have, because the catch is in storage capacity. So the catch is not in generating electricity. There is in many countries, including Sierra Leone, over 250 sun days a year. The question is really in what do we do in capturing all that energy that is available. So much sun, but there's so many issues as well. And that's in the battery house that is hidden here below the solar panels. So what is interesting about it, not just in terms of what it technically does, that's a sort of a decentralized system, right? So it's kind of like the introduction of the mobile phone, but now we are because we're skipping the rollout of a national grid, immediately favoring the development in rural areas of individual mini grids that are then available for that local town. So I plotted here on the map on the right all these blue dots. That is our the area of research, and then half of those are given a mini grid that you see on the previous picture and here on the left, right? So typically it's here at the bottom. It's built close to a clinic, and I have some things to say about the immediate benefits of access to a mini grid for clinics. So it'll be a nice example to look at. But it's supposed to be enough to also charge individual households and businesses in towns, right? And if you were careful enough to spot the location of Sierra Leone on the first slide, you would have seen that outside Freetown here, most of the country is purely in the dark, right? So this is really turning on the light. Now, just to show how impressive this is, for many countries, it has taken up to a decade to electrify 100 towns. The UK investment here through the Foreign Office is trying to change that process in the span of 2 years. Right? So we're really switching on the light here in a very short time frame. And again, linking it back to my type of work would then be like, okay, given technology, let me follow what changes in these towns as here on the left by looking at what happens before to after in the 100 places with the mini-grid comparing to the 100 places without the mini-grid. Right, so that's the sort of the empirical setup that is behind something like this, the VD project. But we have some early results to show. So here's what we look at clinics. And on the left are the clinics which are part of this electrification program, and a CHC here is a clinic. And we have comparison clinics on the right. And a simple comparison already gives us that most of the clinics, actually 73% of clinics who are part of this mini-grid program, have over 15 hours of electricity per day, compared to just 29, so 30% of clinics that have access to 15 hours or more in the comparison sites, right? So that's already creating a huge shift, basically just in terms of light and in terms of what that means for opening hours and staff presence and what you could electrify. So if we look at the next stage, so this is the first stage, basically. The next stage is like, okay, what do we see then in differences in terms of people's appliances? So on the left again are the clinics, and we see a pretty large 20 percentage points increase in whether people have something like a fridge, or a 13% increase, where a percentage point increase in whether these clinics have a sterilizer or a freezer, or are able to include the monitor, etc. Now, this doesn't translate completely yet into whether these appliances are available all the time, because there may still be capacity problems, as I'll say later, but we can see already a huge shift in what people are investing in by having, more reliable access to something as maybe pretty simple as a mini-grid. Now, does that then translate into whether people are more likely to come to clinics? So what I've plotted here is basically one of our research assistants painstakingly going through the clinic records of all these different clinics and trying to look at the monthly utilization rates. So this is basically the number of patients that come in for, this is now the graph for follow-up visits, but you can think of new visits as well. And the blue line gives us a line of clinics without access to a mini-grid, and the red line gives us something for the clinics with access to a mini-grid. And the dotted line, that's the vertical, is the moment that electrification happened for these clinics. And the nice part here is that you see an immediate shift from before and after in these clinics of people coming to the clinics. It's happening in both, but it's happening a lot more in the places with access to electricity. So had we stopped looking at this picture in the first first year, then we would have been pretty enthusiastic. However, something else is shifting over time. It seems like the benefits of electricity access are diminishing over time. Now that worries us for a couple of reasons, and of course, given that I'm here talking to your group, it also means that I think I know where the problem comes from. What we look at the beginning is a fresh set of solar panels and a fresh battery. But often batteries tend to run out in 2 or 3 years. And so it was a bit of misleading to have the first picture, because it shows you there was a lot of access to electricity for more than 15 hours a day. However, the capacity is the large constraint. So while there's still a light, most of the machinery cannot all be running at the same time. Most of the machineries that people would like to use need to take shifts in terms of whether they are on or off, and the capacity is going down with the time that the battery is in place. So the capacity of the storage is the main issue. One, of course, is cleaning of the solar panels, right? So I took a picture here from internet because I couldn't quickly find one from my own from our own sites. But of course, dust is a clear issue for generation, right? So setting it up is one, maintaining it is another. But I don't think this is the bigger issue. It is related to what I said earlier. So here, if I looked at the differences in capacity of the systems, so some clinics have a small one, less than 20 kilowatt hours. Some have a big one. that's not correlated to how many hours of electricity you have available. So that is not a guarantee. So that gives you another sign that it's more than the generation capacity. It is to have access to light at night or access to the machinery at the clinic is again likely pointing towards storage as a main constraint. And this is how many battery rooms look like. This is my friend Frank Frimpong. It's an example from Ghana because he had his camera closely available yesterday. This is trying to connect all the batteries that he has separately together in one what I would say dangerous room. And thank God he took a pen and wrote where plus and minus is on the wall behind where the wires are sticking out, right? A typical battery house, this is a beautiful one actually with gel batteries, sort of looks like this. Now for many of them, I miswrote appliances, the issue is they can't run everything at the same time. So fridges and freezer are often shut off for more than 8 hours, and you can imagine what that means if you wanted to store medicine, if you wanted to store vaccines, which of course is right now a very hot issue, or blood samples or whatever. And they can't often run multiple systems at the same time. So they would have to switch on the on and off between the generator and the solar panels, given whether they want to run the water pump in addition to running the freezer. You can't run it both at the same time. So that gives a capacity constraint, again, for the storage. So if we compare what the options that people have in one slide, it is that most clinics and residential users or small businesses choose lead batteries because they're cheaper. However, they have a very short time span. They're really not ideal, and they're very slow to charge. Now, the alternative that's available now and maybe growing in terms of feasibility is a lithium battery. It's a much longer time span. But if things break down in a few years, it means that maybe the very high upfront costs are not worth it over the longer run. In addition to it being expensive, it has high transportation costs. It gets there. It's very slow in delivery. Imagine the clinic that we showed earlier is a few, like half a day's drive away from the main harbor, and it takes a long time to clear customs, and batteries have to be flown in or actually come in by ship from China. So imagine if one breaks, what we often see is that places close or clinics are running on generators again for months on end, because it's very hard to get by. And again, and this gives a nice bridge to where Sunny will go later, is that it is dependent on rare and expensive materials. So it's, in a sense, if we think about the potential for increase to access to electrification, right? That whole dark area, if that turns into the light, you can see a huge demand curve there. And it seems then that relying on rare materials is a less sustainable strategy than potentially an alternative, right? So there's already a choice here, but maybe there's a chance for something else. So this is why I'm probably at this conference. Another one, which is what we would need is a low-cost sustainable battery. And ideally one that is made not from imported materials from far away, but from local materials. And a reason for me to be excited about a group like you is that what I would hope is that we can try to, in the near future, come towards an energy capacity problem that isn't dependent on lithium batteries, but on something else, right? And space often isn't a constraint. So you can build a big battery, which I can see some of the flow batteries are. But the challenge would be to make it low cost and accessible, because it, in addition to creating development, is also something much more democratic, right? It creates access for a group that now does not have access, but is highly dependent on development elsewhere, funding, materials, and restrictions. So that's it. And let me close there and see if there are questions from your group, and close by the real meme that's behind every 60 seconds, because there's no time to waste. Because also in Africa, every 60 seconds, a minute passes.